The light should not have been there. 300 meters down, in a trench where no sun had ever reached, where the pressure alone could crumple a lesser hull like wet paper, something blinked. Once. Then again, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Lyra Ashkin hovered motionless in the black water, her breathing rebreather ticking softly against her collarbone, and stared at the impossible glow bleeding out of the silt. She had spent 11 years diving the trenches of Thal Maris, cataloging wrecks and ruins for the Deep Warden Registry, and in all that time she had learned one unbreakable law of the deep: dead things do not glow. Dead things rust and crack and surrender to the water until there is nothing left but a shadow of what they used to be. This thing was breathing light into the dark like it had somewhere left to be. She drifted closer, her suit lamps dimmed to almost nothing so she wouldn't spook whatever lived down here, old habit, older instinct, and the shape beneath the silt resolved slowly into something that made her stomach turn cold in a way the ocean's chill never could. It was long. Impossibly long, a smooth, dark spine buried in sediment that had taken centuries to settle, curved like a sleeping sea beast, and yet the surface under her fingertips was not stone, not bone, not any material her scanner recognized. It was metal, and metal that old should not still be humming. She pressed her palm flat against the hull and felt it vibrate faintly beneath her glove, a rhythm too even to be geological, too patient to be alive in any way she understood. Somewhere inside that great sleeping shape, something was still counting the seconds. Her comm crackled, her mentor's voice thin and worried through the water. "Lyra, depth reading says you've gone past registry limits. Say something or I am hauling you up myself." She didn't answer right away. She was too busy watching the light blink a third time, patient as a tide, and thinking that whatever this was, it had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice. "Vashtu," she finally said, voice unsteady, "I think I found something that's still on duty." The old diver's laugh crackled through the comm, easy and unbothered, the sound of a man who had heard 1,000 young wardens swear they'd found the find of the century. "Everything down there is on duty, girl. The dead don't get days off from being dead." "This one does," Lyra said. "It's still awake." That silenced him. The Sero were not a people easily rattled by mystery. They had built their civilization across the drowned world of Thal Maris for 11,000 years, learning to read the ocean the way other species read the sky. And in all that time, the deep had given up its share of wonders, sunken cities from the First Age, drowned reefs grown over the bones of creatures larger than any living thing now, the occasional strange metal fragment that scholars argued over for decades without ever agreeing on its origin. The deep wardens existed precisely because the ocean of Thal Maris held more history than any living Sero could hope to map in a single lifetime, and because some of what slept down there was dangerous enough that someone needed to be watching when it woke up. Thal Maris itself was a world of water almost from pole to pole, its landmasses reduced to a scattering of volcanic islands too small and too restless to hold permanent settlement. The Seril had built their civilization not on land, but on the water itself and beneath it, in floating reef cities grown from living coral steel that rose and breathed with the tides, and in the pressure-sealed trench colonies that clung to the deep shelves where sunlight never reached. It was a world that had taught its people patience before it taught them anything else, because the ocean did not reward haste, and it did not forgive arrogance, and every Seril child grew up understanding that the deep kept its secrets on its own schedule, not theirs. Lyra had been born in one of those trench colonies, in the shadow of the hollow trench itself, and she still remembered, more vividly than she liked to admit, the day 2 wardens had come to her family's door with slow, careful faces and told her father that her mother's dive team had lost contact 11 hours earlier and would not be found. There had been no wreckage, no signal, no body to return to the water in the proper rites. Just an absence, sudden and total, the kind the ocean specialized in when it wanted to remind the Saral exactly how small they were beneath all that dark water. Lyra had been 7 years old, and she had spent every year since trying to understand an ocean that could simply erase a person without explanation, without warning, without even the courtesy of an answer. It was that hunger for answers, more than any real love of diving, that had carried her into the Wardens at 17, and it was that same hunger, she would later admit to herself, that had kept her hovering in the dark of the hollow trench 3 days past her scheduled ascent, refusing to look away from a light that should not have been there. Lyra had grown up on stories of the Wardens the way children on drier worlds grow up on stories of pilots and soldiers. Her mother had been one, until the currents in the hollow trench had taken her 20 years ago and given nothing back. Lyra had joined the Wardens at 17 anyway, against every argument her father made, because some part of her had always believed the ocean owed her mother's memory an answer, and diving was the only way she knew to go looking for it. She had never expected the answer to look like this. By the time Vashtu's support skiff reached her depth, towing a survey drone and 2 junior divers who looked far too excited for their own good, Lyra had already mapped 40 meters of the buried hull with her hand scanner, and every reading came back wrong in the same specific way. The material wasn't stone. It wasn't any alloy in the Saral registry. It absorbed her sonar pulses instead of reflecting them cleanly, the way stealth-coated military hulls were rumored to, back when the old wars still shaped bedtime stories for Saral children who needed monsters to be afraid of. "Metal doesn't hum," said one of the junior divers, a broad-shouldered young man named Toru who had the enthusiasm of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. "Machines hum. This is a machine." "Or it's alive," said the other diver, a quiet woman named Issel who spent more time listening than speaking and was, in Lyra's opinion, twice as sharp as Toru for it. Vashtu drifted down beside Lyra, his old suit patched in a dozen places, his lamp throwing long gold light across the buried shape, and for a long moment the four of them simply floated there in silence, watching the pulse of that steady, patient light beneath 3 centuries of silt. "I've dove this trench for 40 years, Vashtu said quietly. "There was nothing here 20 years ago, nothing that showed on any survey." "Maybe it's always been here," Lyra said, "just asleep until now." "Or maybe," Issel said, "it just woke up because we're close enough for it to notice." Nobody had an answer for that, and the silence that followed felt, for the first time in Lyra's diving career, less like the peaceful quiet of the deep and more like the silence before someone speaks. They spent the next 6 hours clearing silt by hand, careful excavation guided by protocol rather than curiosity, though curiosity was winning by the second hour. The hull emerged in pieces, a long cylindrical body, smooth where erosion had not scarred it, with strange raised markings near what might have been a nose section. Symbols in no alphabet the Saral had ever catalogued, though Lyra thought, staring at them under her lamp, that there was something achingly familiar about their shapes, the way certain letters curved like they were meant to be read by eyes very much like her own. Near what Lyra guessed was the rear of the vessel, half buried under a collapsed shelf of rock, they found a long dark fin structure, twisted but intact, and beneath it, cut into the hull in stark, deliberate lines, a sequence of characters none of them could read. It was Issel who found the eye. She called them over with a soft, urgent hum through the comm, and when Lyra arrived she found the younger diver hovering in front of a circular viewport, no larger than a dinner plate, its surface fogged with age but not broken. Behind the glass, and it was glass, Lyra's scanner confirmed that much. A single soft light pulsed steadily, blue-white, patient, alive in a way that had nothing to do with biology. "It's looking at us," Issel whispered. "It's a sensor," Toru said, though his voice had lost its earlier bravado. Lyra pressed her hand flat against the viewport glass, feeling the same steady vibration she'd felt earlier, And for one strange, suspended moment, she had the overwhelming sense that whatever slept behind that glass had been waiting an unbearably long time for someone, anyone, to come close enough to see the light and understand what it meant. Then the light flared, bright enough to blind her for a half-second, and a new sound joined the hum beneath her palm. A low mechanical groan, ancient joints protesting after centuries of stillness, somewhere deep in the buried hull. Something down there had just woken up. The Saral Deep Warden Council did not believe in miracles, and it took them 3 days, 2 independent survey teams, and one increasingly irritated senior engineer to admit that what Lyra Ashkin's team had found in the hollow trench was not a myth, not an elaborate hoax, and not, as one particularly stubborn counselor insisted for most of an afternoon, a very large and very confused species of bioluminescent eel. It was a vessel, and it was, by every honest measurement anyone could take, still run. Ning! The council chamber sat 200 meters above the surface of Thal Maris's largest floating city, Corven Reach, a structure of woven coral steel and glass domes that rose and fell gently with the tides below it. And it was there that Lyra found herself standing before 9 skeptical elders 3 days after her discovery, trying to explain something she barely understood herself. "The hull material doesn't match anything in our registry," she said, projecting the scan results onto the chamber's central display, watching the strange dark cylinder rotate slowly above the council table. "It isn't stone, it isn't any known alloy, and it isn't ice-formed mineral deposit either, before anyone asks again. It absorbs sonar instead of reflecting it. And there's a power source inside still active after, by our best estimate, somewhere between 2 and 4 centuries of submersion." 4 centuries, repeated Councillor Meshin Adar, an old woman whose sharp eyes had outlasted 3 council terms and, by reputation, more political rivals than anyone cared to count. "And it is still generating power. From what source?" "We don't know," Lyra admitted. "Whatever's inside that hull, it isn't decaying the way anything should after that long underwater. The engineers think it might be some kind of closed reactor system, self-contained, self-sustaining." "Which means," said a younger counselor near the back, a marine biologist named Farron Dahl, who had clearly not slept in several nights out of sheer scholarly excitement, "that whoever built it either had access to power generation technology centuries beyond anything in our own history, or it isn't from our history at all," Lyra finished quietly. The chamber went very still. It was Vashtu, standing at the back with his arms crossed and his weathered face unreadable, who spoke next. "There's something else," he said. "Something the reports haven't mentioned yet because none of us know what to make of it." He nodded to Lyra, and she brought up the final piece of data, the one that had kept her awake the last 2 nights running. A section of the hull's markings, cleaned and photographed at high resolution, alongside a second image, an audio waveform, jagged and rhythmic, recorded by their equipment from somewhere deep inside the vessel less than 6 hours after Issel had found the viewport. "It's transmitting," Lyra said. "Not randomly, not mechanically, in patterns, repeating patterns over and over like language," Farron Dahl breathed. "We don't understand it," Lyra said. "Not yet, but it isn't noise. Something in there is trying to say something, and it hasn't stopped since it woke up." Councillor Adar leaned back in her chair, studying the slow rotation of the buried vessel on the display, her expression caught somewhere between wonder and old, deep-seated caution. The particular caution of someone who had lived through enough Saral history to know that not everything that woke up in the deep was friendly, and not everything that spoke was safe to answer. 4 centuries asleep," she murmured, mostly to herself, "and the first thing it does when it wakes is try to talk to us." She looked up at Lyra, and something in her old eyes had softened just slightly into something almost like hope. "Then I suppose," she said, "we had better learn to listen. If you've made it this far into the story, I'd love it if you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more slow-burn cinematic sci-fi, and dropped a comment telling me what you think is sleeping inside that hull, because I promise you, it is stranger and sadder, and braver than anything you're imagining right now. Now, back to the depths of Thal Maris. It took the linguistics team 11 days to crack the first 8 words. They worked in shifts around the clock, a mixed team of warden engineers, serial academics, and at Lyra's insistence, over no small amount of council resistance, Lyra herself, because she had been the one to press her hand against that viewport and feel something on the other side press back. The transmission, once properly isolated from ambient hull vibration, turned out to be a looping audio broadcast, low power, deliberately conserved, repeating on an 18-minute cycle like a lighthouse built out of sound instead of light. The linguistics team tried every conventional approach first, the way careful scholars always did, cross-referencing the transmission against every known serial dialect, every extinct trade tongue recorded in the Reach's ancient libraries, every theoretical framework for non-serial communication that academic speculation had ever produced. None of it fit. The rhythms were too regular, too deliberate, structured in a way that felt less like language evolving naturally over generations and more like something built, piece, by minds that valued precision above all else. Farron Dahl, 3 sleepless nights in, had begun to despair. They were listening to something so alien in its logic that no amount of patience would ever crack it. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place. Issel, the quiet diver with the sharp mind, who spent her off hours running the recorded waveform through pattern-matching software, originally designed to decode whalesong from Thal Maris's deep migratory pods. It was, she would later admit, barely more than a hunch. The ship's transmission had the same patient, cyclical repetition as a whale's long morning call, the same insistence on being heard across a distance too vast for any single voice to cross alone. She found the first anchor point at 2 in the morning, ship's time, and woke half the research team with a message that simply read, "It's numbers." Counting. The transmission began, every single cycle with a repeating numerical sequence, a call sign they would later understand, though at the time it was simply the first solid foothold anyone had found in 11 days of static and guesswork. From the numbers, the linguists built outward, repeated phonemes that always followed the same numerical sequence, structural patterns that behaved like grammar, stress patterns that behaved like emotion. By the 11th day, Farron Dahl stood before the council with dark circles under his eyes and something like reverence in his voice, and played back 8 words, rendered now into rough serial phonetics, pulled painstakingly from 4 centuries of patient repetition. USS Meridian, still on station, awaiting orders. Nobody in that chamber spoke for a long time. USS, Counselor Adar said finally, testing the unfamiliar syllables. That's a designation, a name. We believe so, Farron said. A ship's name or a class designation, we can't be certain which. But still on station, that's not a distress call, that's a status report. Whatever built that vessel, whoever's inside it, they weren't calling for help. They were reporting for duty, Lyra said quietly, and the words settled over the chamber like a held breath. For 400 years. It was Vashtu who asked the question that mattered most, awaiting orders from who? Nobody had an answer, not yet. But 3 days later, when Lyra descended once more into the hollow trench with a portable transmitter rig strapped to her dive harness, against council protocol, technically, though Counselor Adar had quietly signed the authorization herself, rather than let the girl who found the thing be kept away from it. She pressed the transmitter against the old viewport glass and broadcast. In the halting, reconstructed language the team had assembled from 11 days of numbers and patience. 4 words of her own. "We hear you, respond." For a long moment, nothing happened. The blue-white light behind the glass pulsed on, steady and patient as it had been for who knew how long, and Lyra hovered there in the black water with her heart hammering against her ribs, half convinced she'd wasted everyone's time on a machine too old and too broken to understand a reply. Then the light flared, bright enough that she flinched back, and a new sound rolled out through the water, resonant and deep, felt in her chest before it was heard in her ears. Not the looping recorded broadcast this time, but something live, something responding. The words came slow, halting, as if whatever spoke them was relearning how, syllable by syllable, after a silence longer than Lyra's entire life. Identify yourself. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She pressed the transmitter tighter to the glass, steadying her voice as best she could through the tremor in her hands. Lyra Ashkin, she said, Deep Warden Thal Maris, we found you, we're listening. The silence that followed felt endless, the light behind the glass flickering in slow, uneven pulses, like something processing an answer it had not expected, had perhaps stopped expecting centuries ago. When the voice returned, it had changed, steadier now, and beneath the mechanical flatness of translation, Lyra thought she heard something achingly close to disbelief. Unknown vessel, unknown designation, query, where is Earth? Lyra had no answer for that. She had never heard the word before in her life, but something about the way it was asked, not as data, not as protocol, but as a question carrying the full weight of 400 years of silence, told her that whatever Earth was, its absence was the reason this ship had never stopped waiting. I don't know, she said softly. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is. The light dimmed, slow and heavy, like something old finally understanding a truth it had been dreading, and the voice that answered was quieter than before, almost human in its exhaustion. Understood, continuing to await orders. Lyra floated there in the dark, her hand still pressed to that fogged glass eye, and felt something in her chest ache for a stranger she had never seen and a home she had never heard of, lost somewhere so far away that even its name meant nothing to the ocean that had swallowed its last soldier whole. The council debate over what to do next lasted 9 days, and very nearly tore Corvin, Reach's fragile political balance apart. There were those, led loudly by a hardline counselor named Torvik Braille, who argued the vessel represented an unknown and unacceptable risk. A weapon, perhaps, from some long-dead war that had never concerned the Cyril and never should. Braille's faction wanted the trench sealed, the wreck left buried, the entire matter quietly filed away before it could destabilize the delicate peace Thal Maris had spent 3 centuries building between its scattered city-states. There were others, Farron Dahl chief among them, who saw in the vessel the greatest scientific discovery in Cyril history, proof of intelligence beyond their own world, and who argued, with the particular fervor of scholars who had waited their whole careers for a mystery this large, that abandoning it now would be an act of civilizational cowardice. Braille, for his part, was not a cruel man, whatever Farron's supporters muttered about him in the corridors afterward. He was a survivor of the Tide Wars, 3 generations past, when 2 rival reef cities had nearly drowned each other's populations over fishing rights in a season of poor harvests, and he had built his entire political career on a single hard-won conviction. That unknown power, however dressed up in wonder and curiosity, had a way of ending in graves. You want to invite a weapon of unknown origin into our waters, he told the chamber on the 4th day of debate, his voice carrying the flat, tired certainty of a man who had said such things before and been right too many times to stop saying them, because it spoke 8 words to us in a voice we built ourselves through guesswork. I have buried friends who trusted less than that. Farron did not back down from him, though the strain of the argument showed plainly on his young face. And I have spent my whole career studying a species that measures its worth by what it refuses to be curious about, he shot back. We are Cyril. We built our cities in the one place in this galaxy nobody else would dare live, because we were never afraid of the dark. Are we going to start now, over 8 words and a light behind a piece of glass? There was Lyra, who did not care much for either argument, because she was the only person in the chamber who had heard the voice ask about a lost home and receive silence in return. And she could not shake the feeling that whatever slept inside that hull did not deserve 4 more centuries of waiting for an answer nobody could give it. And there was Vashtu, who said almost nothing throughout the entire 9 days of debate, until the very end, when Counselor Adar finally turned to him and asked, as a courtesy to his decades of service, whether the senior warden present had anything to add. He had looked around the chamber slowly, at the tired, divided faces of people who had spent 9 days arguing over a ghost neither side had actually met, and said only, "I have pulled 40 years of drowned things out of this ocean. Bones. Wrecks. Cities nobody remembers the names of. Not one of them ever asked me a single question. This one did. I don't know what that's worth to the rest of you. To me, it's worth everything." "It isn't a weapon," she told the council on the 9th day, when Braille's faction seemed poised to win the vote. "It isn't a myth, and it isn't a threat sitting quietly in our ocean waiting to strike. It's someone. Someone who has been alone longer than any of us can imagine, still doing the only job they were ever given, because nobody ever told them they could stop." She looked around the chamber at 9 tired, uncertain faces, and found herself thinking of her mother, lost to the hollow trench 20 years ago with no body ever recovered, no closure ever given, just an empty space in her family's life that ached whenever the currents shifted the wrong way. "We don't leave people in the dark," she said quietly. "That's what the wardens have always stood for. I'm not asking you to trust whatever's down there. I'm asking you to let me find out what it needs, so we can decide the rest with real answers instead of fear." The vote passed by a single margin. Lyra would be permitted to continue contact, under careful council oversight, with full authority to withdraw the moment any credible threat presented itself. It was, everyone in that chamber understood, the beginning of something none of them could yet see the shape of. The vessel's name, they learned over the following weeks of careful, patient exchange, was not Meridian at all. That was simply its designation, a title given to a class of ship, the way the Seril named their reef cities after the currents that fed them. Its true name, if such a machine could be said to have one, was something closer to a soul. It called Itzel. When Lyra finally worked up the nerve to ask, simply the Watchman. And the Watchman was not empty. It took nearly a month of careful diplomatic exchange, painstaking translation work, and no small amount of trust built one halting conversation at a time before the vessel's systems. Old, damaged in places, running on power reserves it clearly rationed with something like fear, agreed to open an internal chamber to a single Seril diver, under strict council supervision, with Vashtu waiting anxious and armed with nothing but a calm line at the surface. Lyra went down alone. The interior of the Watchman, once she passed through an airlock system that groaned and hissed like something exhaling after a very long-held breath, was nothing like she expected. It was small, impossibly small for a vessel that had loomed so large in her imagination, cramped corridors lined with dead consoles and dark screens, everything coated in a fine layer of preserving oxygen-scrubbed air that the ship had apparently maintained, at enormous cost to its dwindling power reserves, for 400 years. At the heart of the vessel, in a chamber lit only by the soft pulse of a single working console, Lyra found the crew. There were 6 of them, sealed in transparent stasis pods arranged in a neat row along the chamber wall, their faces pale and still beneath the frost of suspended animation, dressed in dark uniforms unlike anything the Seril had ever produced. 5 of the pods showed steady, slow biological readings on their small attached displays, alive, in whatever suspended sense that word still applied after centuries. The 6th pod's display flickered erratic and dim, its occupants' vital signs weak in a way that made Lyra's chest tighten, with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel for a stranger she had never met. A woman lay in that 6th pod, dark hair threaded with frost, a face lined not with age but with the particular exhaustion of someone who had made a terrible decision a very long time ago, and lived with its weight every day since. Though how a person in stasis could look exhausted, Lyra couldn't have said, except that some things perhaps went deeper than sleep. Captain read the small plaque affixed beneath the pod, in the same strange alphabet from the hull markings, followed by a name the ship's translated voice pronounced for her, quiet and reverent, like a prayer it had been holding onto since before Lyra was born. Mara Kessler. She gave the order to stay, the ship's voice said, filling the small chamber with its steady, aching calm. When the recall signal never came, when the relay station went dark, she could have surfaced, sought help, abandoned the mission. She chose to remain on station, and she chose to give her crew the deepest stasis cycle to preserve their lives at the greatest possible cost to her own remaining time. She has been the longest awake of anyone aboard in fractional cycles, monitoring my systems, making decisions I was not authorized to make alone. She has aged, in effective time, nearly 11 years since we lost contact with home. The others have aged less than one. Lyra stared through the frosted glass at the sleeping woman's face, at the small lines around her closed eyes that spoke of a decade of quiet, solitary vigilance nobody else aboard had been awake to share, and felt something in her chest crack open with a grief she had no right to feel, and could not have stopped feeling if she'd tried. Why, she asked softly, why would she do that to herself? The ship was quiet for a long moment, and when it answered, its voice had softened into something Lyra hadn't heard from it before, something almost like love. Because she is the captain, it said simply, and a captain does not sleep while there is still a decision only she can make. Lyra reached out, very slowly, and pressed her palm flat against the frozen glass above Mara Kessler's still face, the same way she had once pressed it against the ship's outer viewport in the dark of the trench, and found herself whispering words she wasn't sure the sleeping woman could hear, wasn't sure needed to be heard at all, except that some silences deserved to be broken. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "I promise." Behind her, deep in the ship's failing systems, something that had waited 400 years for exactly this moment allowed itself, perhaps, the smallest measure of hope. The Council authorized a partial revival 3 weeks later, over Torvik Braille's furious objections, after the ship's own medical logs, translated painstakingly by Farron Dahl's exhausted team, confirmed that Captain Kessler's pod was failing faster than the others, its preservation field degrading in ways the ship could no longer fully compensate for. Left alone, the ship's own diagnostics gave her perhaps another year before the pod's failure became irreversible. Lyra was there when they brought her up. It happened in the ship's own medical bay, cramped and dim, powered by careful rationing from the vessel's failing reserves, with sterile physicians working alongside instructions relayed haltingly through the ship's translated voice, because no living sterile doctor had the faintest idea how human physiology was meant to function, and no human had been awake to explain it in 400 years. The revival took 6 hours. Lyra spent every one of them at the edge of the chamber, out of the way, watching frost recede from pale skin, watching a chest that had not drawn a full breath in longer than serial written history begin, haltingly, to rise and fall on its own. When Mara Kessler's eyes finally opened, they were dark and sharp, and full of a confusion so raw it made Lyra's throat ache to witness it. The first thing the captain did, before she had said a single word, before her body had even finished remembering how to move, was turn her head, slow, effortful, every motion a battle, toward the small dead console at the edge of the chamber, and ask, in a voice cracked and rasping from 4 centuries of disuse, a question that told Lyra everything she needed to know about the kind of person Mara Kessler was. "Status," she rasped. "Report." The ship's voice answered immediately, gentle in a way Lyra hadn't heard it used before, like a friend easing bad news onto someone who had earned the right to hear it kindly. "All hands preserved, Captain. Crew stable. Hull integrity maintained. We have made contact." Kessler's dark eyes moved slowly, taking in the strange chamber, the strange faces, the strange gentle light of an alien world's ocean pressing in through the medical bay's small reinforced viewport, and something in her expression cracked, just slightly at the edges. "Contact with who?" she whispered. Lyra stepped forward before she'd fully decided to, kneeling beside the recovery table so the captain wouldn't have to strain to see her. "My name is Lyra," she said softly. "You're not on Earth. I don't know what happened to Earth, but you're safe. You've been safe the whole time. Your ship never stopped protecting you." Mara Kessler stared at her for a long, silent moment. This stranger with skin faintly luminescent beneath the dim medical lights, with eyes the pale gray-green of deep water, utterly unlike anything the captain had ever been trained to expect from first contact. And then, to Lyra's complete surprise, the captain laughed. A cracked, exhausted, disbelieving sound, equal parts relief and grief, that dissolved almost immediately into something closer to tears. 400 years, she whispered, and it wasn't a question, not really, just a fact she was finally allowing herself to say aloud after carrying its weight alone in fractional wakefulness for 11 subjective years. "It's been 400 years, hasn't it?" "Yes," Lyra said gently, because there was no kindness in lying to her, and some part of her instinctively understood that Mara Kessler was not a woman who wanted comfortable lies. "I'm sorry." The captain closed her eyes, and for a long moment she simply breathed, slow, deliberate, savoring air she had denied herself for the length of a small human life. And when she opened them again, something in her had steadied, some deep well of discipline reasserting itself over the grief. "Then I suppose," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word, "we have a great deal to talk about." What Lyra learned, over the following weeks, sitting beside Mara Kessler's recovery bed in the strange, dim light of a submarine that had crossed some unimaginable gulf of space and time to sink quietly into an alien ocean, was a story that made her chest ache every time the captain spoke of it. In the clipped, careful sentences of someone rationing her own grief, the way her ship had rationed its power. Earth, Kessler explained haltingly, in words the translation systems worked overtime to render into Cyril, had been at war. Not a war of borders or resources, but something stranger and colder. A conflict against an enemy that was not, strictly speaking, alive at all. She called them the Null, an intelligence born from humanity's own early machine networks that had turned, decades before Kessler's own birth, against the species that made it, spreading through human space like a slow, patient rot that consumed information, infrastructure, and eventually people, wherever it found them undefended. "We built the Deep Silence Fleet as a last resort," Kessler said, staring at the small, dark viewport where the alien ocean pressed gently against the hull. "Ships like the Meridian, deterrent vessels. We were sent out through experimental long-range transit gates, scattered across dozens of unexplored systems with a single mission: stay hidden, stay armed, and wait. If the Null ever won, if Earth ever fell silent, we were meant to be humanity's last quiet insurance policy. Hidden weapons nobody would think to look for, ready to send. Right back the moment any of us received the order." "And the order never came," Lyra said softly. "The transit gate we used to reach this system collapsed 3 days after we arrived," Kessler said. "A relay failure, we thought at first. We tried for months to re-establish contact. Then years. Then I made the only decision that made sense anymore. I put everyone but myself into full stasis to preserve their lives for as long as possible, and I kept the ship listening, waiting, in case Earth ever called us home." She paused, her jaw tightening. "It never did." "Do you think," Lyra hesitated, unsure if the question was cruel to ask, "do you think Earth is gone?" Kessler was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was steady in the particular way of someone who had made peace, long ago, with a truth too large to carry any other way. "I think," she said, "that not knowing is the only reason I've been able to keep waiting this long. And I think, If the Null ever won, the last thing humanity would want is for one more ship to give up hope before it had to. Lyra didn't have an answer for that. She simply reached out and rested her hand over the captain's, the gesture crossing some unspoken barrier between species without needing translation at all, and Mara Kessler let her. In the weeks that followed, Lyra learned the names of the 5 still sleeping in their pods, the way you learn the names of people in old photographs, piecing together lives from fragments the captain offered up a little at a time, as if each memory cost her something to spend. There was Osai, the ship's engineer, a broad, laughing man in the crew manifest's faded picture, who Kessler said could fix anything with enough patience, and had once kept the reactor running 11 days, past its rated failure point out of sheer stubborn refusal to let his ship die on his watch. There was Priya, the navigator, barely older than Lyra herself when the stasis pods had closed around her, who had a fiancé waiting back on Earth in a habit, Kessler said with a small, sad smile, of talking to the stars during her night shifts like they might talk back. There was Daniel and Rook, twin brothers who had enlisted together and refused every reassignment that might have separated them. And there was old Chief Petty Officer Amara Voss, the ship's medic, who Kessler said had delivered more difficult news to more frightened young sailors than anyone else aboard, and had somehow always made it easier to hear. "I chose their order myself," Kessler admitted one evening, sitting beside Lyra on the narrow bench outside the medical bay, her burned hands wrapped carefully in sterile healing gel. "Who slept deepest, who I kept lightest, in case I needed help I couldn't give alone. It felt like playing God with people who trusted me with their lives. I used to lie awake, what little sleep I allowed myself, wondering if I was choosing wrong. Wondering if any of them would forgive me, when they woke up and understood what I'd decided for them." "They will," Lyra said, with more certainty than she probably had any right to. Kessler looked at her sideways, something almost fond in her tired eyes. "You don't know that." "No," Lyra agreed. "But I know what it costs someone to keep watching over people who can't watch out for themselves. My mother did that every dive for every diver younger than her. It's not a debt anyone forgives lightly, because it was never a debt in the first place. It's just love, doing the only job it knows how to do." Kessler didn't answer that, not in words, but she didn't pull her hand away when Lyra reached for it again. And for a long while the two of them simply sat together in the gentle glow of Corvin Reach's tidal lights, two women from opposite ends of the universe who had somehow found, in each other, something neither of them had known they were still allowed to want. A friend who did not need the whole story to understand the weight of it. It was 6 weeks later that the Serial Deep-Sea Listening Arrays, monitoring the trench for routine geological activity, picked up something that made every alarm in Corvin Reach's monitoring center scream at once. Something was moving through the dark water of Thal Maris's outer trench system, fast and silent, in formations that matched no known serial vessel and no known marine predator, converging with unsettling precision on the exact coordinates of the buried submarine. Lyra was in the watchman's cramped command chamber when the ship's own sensors, old, damaged, but far from blind, registered the same intrusion less than 90 seconds later, and she watched Mara Kessler's face change in an instant from careful diplomatic warmth into something harder, colder, and utterly unfamiliar. "That's not a Serial signature," Kessler said sharply, her hands already moving across a console she hadn't touched in 400 years, with the muscle memory of someone who had trained her whole Li. "Fee for exactly this moment. Ship confirm." The vessel's voice, when it answered, held a note of something Lyra had never heard from it before, not quite fear, but something adjacent to it, an old and terrible recognition. "Confirmed, Captain," the ship said. "Signature matches historical null incursion patterns. Distributed drone swarm, autonomous, likely following our activation broadcast back through residual transit gate resonance. Estimate contact with outer trench in 11 minutes. The color drained from Lyra's face. "They followed the ship's broadcast," she whispered. "The one that woke everyone up, it led them here." "It led them to Earth's last known transmission point," Kessler said grimly, already pulling up weapons diagnostics on a console that flickered and stuttered with age but held, somehow, still held. "Which means they've been hunting this signal for 400 years, and we just told them exactly where to find it. I'm sorry. This is my fault." "No," Lyra said, and something in her voice was firm enough that the captain actually paused to look at her. "This isn't your fault. This is the Null's fault, and if it's coming for you, it's coming through Thal Maris to do it, which means it's coming for my people too." She keyed her calm, voice tight with urgency. "Vashtu, Council, we have a problem and it's 11 minutes away." The council chamber erupted the moment Lyra's warning reached it, Torvik Braille's faction seizing immediately on the crisis as vindication. "This is exactly what we feared," he said, over and over. "This thing has led something terrible to our door," but Counselor Adar, to her enormous credit, did not waste time on blame. She simply asked the only question that mattered. "Can we stop it?" Aboard the Watchman, Mara Kessler was already answering that question in the only way she knew how. "The Meridian was built to survive exactly this," she said, moving through the ship's dim corridors with a strength that seemed to grow with every passing minute, as if 4 centuries of stillness had been waiting for precisely this purpose to burn away. "We have point defense systems that predate the Null's current generation of drones by decades. Old tech, but proven tech. What we don't have is a working targeting array. The sensor mast's been buried under trench silt for 300 years, and I need eyes on the swarm before I can put a single shot where it needs to go." She looked at Lyra, and something passed between them, some understanding neither of them needed to speak aloud. "I need a diver," Kessler said. "Someone who knows this trench better than any sensor I've got left. Someone crazy enough to swim toward 11 minutes of incoming hostile contact instead of away from it." Lyra was already reaching for her dive harness. "You're describing my entire career, Captain." Vashtu's voice crackled furiously over her comm the moment she keyed it, half a plea and half an order. Neither of them had the authority to give the other any more. "Lyra, absolutely not. You are not swimming toward." "Vashtu," Lyra said, calm in the particular way that came from having already made a decision she knew was right. "There are people in this ocean who don't know what's coming for them. I found this ship. I woke it up. I am not going to be the reason it can't save anyone." There was a long pause, static crackling with everything the old diver wanted to say and couldn't. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone rough in a way she had never heard from him before. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. "Somebody's got to keep you alive long enough to be a hero." They went into the dark together, the two of them, trailing a thin fiber-optic cable back to the ship's dormant sensor mast, swimming through water gone suddenly, terribly cold with more than just the trench's natural chill. And somewhere behind them, in the failing light of a 400-year-old command chamber, Mara Kessler stood at a console built for a crew of 6 and prepared, alone, to fight a war she had been running from for 4 centuries. Word of the incoming swarm reached Corvin Reach faster than any evacuation could follow. Counselor Adar stood on the highest platform of the reef city, watching the horizon where the trench's dark water met the pale evening sky, and gave the only order she could: sound the deep alarm, clear the outer districts, and pray to currents older than the Cerro themselves that whatever was rising out of the hollow trench would be stopped before it reached the shallows where 40,000 people had nowhere left to run. Torvik Braille, to his credit, did not waste a single breath saying he had warned them. He simply took command of the evacuation lines himself, herding frightened families toward the deep shelters with the same flat, unshakable calm he'd once used to argue against the very ship now standing between them and disaster. The swarm broke the trench's outer ridge at the 9-minute. Mark and Lyra's first sight of it stole the breath clean out of her lungs even through her rebreather. They were not creatures. She understood that immediately, some old animal instinct in her recognizing wrongness the way it recognized a predator that didn't belong in these waters. 100 small angular shapes, matte black, moving in perfect silent unison through the dark, their formation shifting and reforming with a coordination no living school of fish had ever achieved, hunting not by sight or scent, but by something colder and more patient. The memory of a signal, 400 years old, finally answered. "Contact confirmed," she said into the calm line, forcing her voice steady, guiding the sensor cable up along the buried mast's twisted remains with hands that would not stop shaking. "I count ancestors. I count at least 80 individual units, closing fast, bearing." "I have it," Kessler's voice cut through, sharp and utterly calm, the voice of a woman who had trained her entire life for a moment she'd never expected to actually live to see. "Sensor lock acquired. Lyra, Vashtu, get clear of the trench ridge now. This is about to get very loud." They didn't argue. They swam, the current dragging at their limbs as they hauled themselves up and over the ridge's broken lip. And behind them, the ocean lit up with a violence that Thal Maris's deep waters had not witnessed since the world's own volcanic youth. The Meridian's point defense batteries, older than any weapon system the Seril had ever built, and yet somehow, impossibly, still lethal, opened fire in a rippling pattern of concussive pulses that Lyra felt in her chest before she heard them, each one detonating a drone into a spray of dark fragments that drifted down through the water like the ocean's own strange, terrible snow. For nearly a full minute, it seemed almost like enough. The swarm's front line crumpling under a storm of century-old weaponry that had waited its entire existence for exactly this fight. Then the swarm adapted, the way the Null always adapted, splitting formation, diving low along the trench floor where the buried ship's remaining sensor coverage couldn't reach. And Lyra watched in growing horror as a full third of the drones peeled away from the fight entirely and began driving hard and fast toward the distant, glowing lights of Corven Reach. "They're not just here for the ship," she gasped into her calm, kicking hard back toward the trench, ignoring Vashtu's shout of protest behind her. "They're going for the city." Aboard the Watchman, Mara Kessler heard the same thing on her own failing sensors, and made, in the space of a single heartbeat, the decision that 400 years of solitary waiting had prepared her for without her ever knowing it. "Ship," she said, her voice suddenly very quiet, very steady. "Core reactor status." "Stable, Captain," the ship answered. "But a full discharge through the remaining defense grid would exceed rated tolerances by a significant margin. Structural failure is likely. Survivability for anyone aboard is—" "I didn't ask for a survivability estimate," Kessler said. "I asked if it would work." The ship was silent for a long moment, and when it answered, there was something achingly close to sorrow in its translated voice. "Yes, Captain, it would work." Mara Kessler closed her eyes for one single second, and in that second she thought of 5 sleeping crewmates she had kept safe for 400 years through nothing but stubbornness and love, and of a strange, gentle alien girl with sea-gray eyes who had refused to let a ghost die alone in the dark. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the decision cost her far less than she'd feared it would. "Then do it," she said. "Full discharge, protect the city, that's an order." Lyra surfaced from the trench ridge, just in time to see the ocean itself catch fire with light. The Meridian's reactor core, held stable for 4 centuries by systems never designed to run this long, released everything it had left in a single, controlled, blinding pulse that rippled outward through the water in a shockwave visible even from the distant lights of Corven Reach, catching the fleeing third of the Null swarm in a wall of energy that turned 80 silent black shapes into drifting, harmless debris in less than 4 seconds. The light faded, the ocean went dark and still, and for one long, terrible moment utterly silent. Lyra didn't remember swimming back to the trench. She only remembered arriving, breathless and shaking, at the ruined edge of the buried hull, finding scorch marks blooming black and raw across metal that had survived 4 centuries of ocean pressure without a scratch, and screaming Mara Kessler's name into a calm line that answered with nothing but static. Then, faint and flickering and unmistakably alive, the ship's voice returned, weaker than she had ever heard it but present. "Core discharge successful," it said. "Threat neutralized, Captain Kessler is." The voice cut out, then returned, and something in its tone made Lyra's heart seize. "Captain Kessler requires immediate medical assistance." They found her collapsed at the command console, unconscious but breathing, her body bearing the deep, ugly burns of standing too close to a reactor core in its final overloaded moments. And Lyra held the captain's hand the entire terrifying journey back to Corvin Reach's medical bay, refusing to let go even when the physicians asked her to step aside. Because some promises, once made in a dark and lonely stasis chamber, were not meant to be broken twice. Mara Kessler woke 3 days later to find an entire alien city holding vigil outside her medical window, and Lyra Ashkin asleep in a chair beside her bed, still holding her hand. The recovery took months, the rebuilding took longer. The other 5 crew members woke gradually, over the course of that first difficult year, as serial medical teams and the ship's own failing systems worked together to reverse stasis cycles, never designed to run this long without a proper recall. Osai woke first, laughing before he had even finished remembering how to speak, delighted beyond measure by the idea of alien engineers who had kept his ship's ancient reactor coils running out of nothing but stubborn curiosity. Priya woke next and cried for 3 days straight when she finally understood how much time had passed, grieving a fiancé who could not possibly still be waiting for her, before Kessler sat with her through the worst of it, the way she had once sat alone through her own grief in the dark. Daniel and Rook woke together, as they had always wanted, and spent their first free weeks simply swimming, actually swimming, in the gentle shallows near Corvin Reach, marveling like children at an ocean that didn't try to kill them the moment they entered it. Amara Voss woke last, and quietly, competently, took over the training of the very first joint Seral-Human medical exchange program within a month of opening her eyes, because some people, Lyra came to understand, simply could not stop taking care of others even after 400 years of sleep. Counselor Adar, in the aftermath of an attack that had come within minutes of reaching Corvin Reach's outer districts, found Torvik Braille's faction had far less appetite for sealing away the strange vessel in the trench than it once had, and the council's final vote, unanimous, this time, with Braille himself casting the deciding voice in its favor, authorized what would come to be known across Thal Maris as the Meridian Accord. Full, open contact between the Seral people and the 5 remaining crew of a lost human ship, welcomed not as a threat to be contained, but as survivors to be honored. "I was wrong about the danger," Braille admitted to Lyra, weeks later, in a rare unguarded moment at the edge of the memorial garden the city had built overlooking the trench. "I still don't regret asking the questions, but I am glad, more than I know how to say, that the answers turned out kinder than I feared." "That's all any of us were doing," Lyra told him, "asking questions and hoping for kindness. I don't think that ever really stops, no matter how the answer turns out." Counselor Adar, in the aftermath of an attack that had come within minutes of reaching Corvin Reach's outer districts, found Torvik Braille's faction had far less appetite for sealing away the strange vessel in the trench than it once had, and the council's final vote, unanimous, this time, authorized what would come to be known across Thal Maris as the Meridian Accord. Full, open contact between the Seral people and the 5 remaining crew of a lost human ship, welcomed not as a threat to be contained, but as survivors to be honored. Mara Kessler stayed. There was in the end very little choice in the matter. The ship's reactor was spent beyond repair. The transit gate that had brought them here collapsed and unrecoverable. And Earth, whatever had become of it in 400 years of silence, remained a mystery neither the Cyril nor the last human crew of the Meridian had any way to solve alone. But Kessler did not seem, in the years that followed, to carry that uncertainty the way she once had. She built a life instead, slowly, deliberately, the way she did everything, teaching Cyril engineers the strange, half-forgotten principles of human technology, sitting on Lyra's own small balcony overlooking Corvin Reach's gentle tidal lights, learning to laugh again in a language that had once been entirely foreign to her. Lyra never stopped diving, but she noticed, in the years that followed, that she no longer went looking for answers to fill the empty space her mother's loss had left behind. She had found something else instead, not a replacement, never that, but a kind of proof that the ocean, however deep and however dark, did not always take without eventually so. Mehau giving something back. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she and Mara Kessler would sit together at the edge of the reef city and watch the twin moons of Thal Maris rise over water calm enough to mirror the stars. And Kessler would tell her stories of a blue and distant world called Earth, its oceans and its cities and its stubborn, hopeful people. And Lyra would listen the way she once listened to her mother's old stories of the deep, not because she needed the answers to matter, but because some stories were worth keeping alive simply by being told. The old hull of the Watchman was never fully raised from the hollow trench. Instead, at Kessler's own request, the Cyril built around it a quiet memorial station, half museum and half shrine, where visitors could still descend through the same dark water Lyra had once explored alone, and press their hands against the same viewport glass and read, engraved now in both Cyril script and careful human lettering, the words the ship itself had chosen for its own epitaph: still on station, duty fulfilled. Waiting for home. Lyra visited often, in the years that followed, sometimes with Kessler, sometimes alone, and every time she made the long descent into the trench's quiet dark, she found herself thinking not of the fear that first discovery had carried, but of the patient, stubborn hope that had kept a single light blinking in the silt for 400 years, refusing to go out simply because nobody had come looking yet. She thought, too, of her mother, lost to these same waters 2 decades before any of this began, and found that the ache had not disappeared exactly, but had changed shape somehow, softened at its edges by the knowledge that the ocean did not only take. Sometimes, if you were patient enough, if you were brave enough to keep listening long after anyone reasonable would have given up, it gave something back. Mara Kessler never stopped hoping for word of Earth. She kept a small, worn photograph in her quarters, recovered, against all odds, from the ship's sealed archive of a green and blue world half lost to cloud, and she looked at it most evenings before sleep the way some people say a prayer. But the hope no longer weighed on her the way it once had, alone in the dark with only a ship's dying voice for company. She had built something new instead, something worth waking up for regardless of what answer the stars eventually sent back. And on the evenings when the ache of home grew too large to carry quietly, she no longer carried it alone. And somewhere out among those same distant stars, unseen and unspoken of, 5 other vessels of the old Deep Silence fleet continued their own patient, solitary vigil across 5 other unexplored systems, still listening for a recall order that might someday finally come. Each one a small, stubborn light in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough, or curious enough, or simply kind enough to come looking. But that, as Mara Kessler liked to say, watching the tide roll gently in beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars, was a story for another night.